And credit, which had seen an increase in availability not seen since the 20s as credit cards such as Diners Club and American Express were introduced, enabled Americans to spend more and more, almost as fast as America was producing. As a result, America got turned into a kind of throwaway society as Americans continued to discard last year's model for the newer version, and American products were increasingly designed not to last very long. Popular culture. The television set would be the second to last link in the web of modern mass media, the final link being that of the internet developed in the 1990s. In 1948, roughly 9% of American homes had a TV set. 6 years later, in 1954, that number increased to 55%. By 1960, 45 million homes, roughly 90% of American homes, had a TV. Arguably, the TV set was the only consumer item more popular than the car during the 1950s. Largely due to the World War II innovation of microwave relay stations, which allowed TV signals to be broadcast over great distances, millions more Americans would get their news and entertainment from television, ending radio's 3-decades-long reign. The 1950s were considered the golden age of television, as the medium rated some of the best talent from movies, radio, and what was left of vaudeville to fill up its programming. Offering 3 stations nationwide, CBS, NBC, and ABC, Americans tuned in to watch the comic antics of Milton Berle, or Sid Caesar and Imogene Coca's Your Show of Shows, which boasted arguably the single most talented staff of writers ever assembled, including Mel Brooks, Woody Allen, Neil Simon, and Carl Reiner. A group of writers who would dramatically alter the mediums of television, theatrical stage, and motion pictures right up to the present. Desi Arnaz and his wife, Lucille Ball, revolutionized the situation comedy by filming their half-hour show with 3 different cameras, which allowed for wider creativity when editing the show together. Americans tuned in to see news programs like See It Now and Person to Person. The Adventures of Superman, the Mickey Mouse Club, and the Howdy Doody Show attracted young and loyal audiences, who also had plenty of spare dollars in the form of their allowance ready to be spent on the products these shows advertised. Television was becoming such a crowded and complex landscape during the 50s that a guide, a TV guide if you will, was first published in 1953 to aid Americans in making their very complex viewing decisions. TV Guide would quickly go on to become the single most widely read magazine in America throughout the last 50 years of our history. As more and more people owned TVs, viewing time also increased. In 1950, the average household watched less than 3 hours a day. By the year 2000, American homes were watching nearly 7 hours daily, a number that has actually been decreasing since the early 1990s, due largely to the rise of the internet. The popular culture of the 1950s was the culture of youth. And while it's impossible to discuss youth culture without discussing music, I'm going to do just that. In the weeks ahead, you'll see a lecture entirely devoted to the rise of rock and roll. Suffice to say for our purposes here and now that by 1957, rock and roll was a dominating entertainment and consumer force as teenagers the nation over poured millions of dollars annually into records, mostly 45s that contained one song on either side, by the likes of Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Jerry Lee Lewis. The motion picture industry actually had a tough go of it during the 1950s as television cut seriously into its profits. By 1950, roughly half the number of people who had gone to the movies 2 years prior were still in attendance. Hollywood adjusted, however, realizing that TV couldn't compete with films in size, sound, or color. Most TV sets at this time were no larger than 19 inches diagonally, and all were black and white, so Hollywood films became larger in size and scale. Epic films abounded during the 1950s, such as the biblical tales of the Ten Commandments and the Greatest Story Ever Told. No film, however, was more epic than 1963's Cleopatra, the single most expensive movie ever made, at a modern bill of over $300 million, featuring set pieces so grand and large they could only be made today with digital effects and a cast so large that only the film Gandhi, which had over 1 million people on screen, could boast a larger cast. Musicals became popular during the 50s. Over 100 would be made for the silver screen during this decade, including Guys and Dolls, The King and I, Damn Yankees, My Fair Lady, The Music Man, West Side Story, and most famously, The Sound of Music, all premiered during this decade. Science fiction and horror films, which had been around for decades, made a prominent resurgence in the 1950s as the world became much more painfully scientifically focused on science's power via the unleashed potential of atomic weaponry. Nearly 200 science fiction films came out during this decade, most of which were pure pulp and barely contained any effects which could even loosely be classified as special. Some films, however, featured enough innovation and brilliant storytelling that the imaginations of audiences for decades afterwards would be captured. War of the Worlds would be retold once again on the big screen by Tom Cruise and would make many different visits to TVs in the form of serial television shows. Invasion of the Body Snatchers would make it onto the big screen again in the 1970s, and again in 2007 with Nicole Kidman. Its theme of this fear of having our community or our country or our world taken over by some unknown and all-powerful evil outside force would be recycled in dozens of other feature films. The Day the Earth Stood Still is the most recent example of a 1950s film which saw its recreation on the modern silver screen. Teens had, perhaps for the first time, a disposable income of their own, if not in the form of an allowance from their parents, then by picking up part-time work at the local gas service station or the corner McDonald's or In-N-Out burger stand. With this money, teens, especially girls, flocked to see 50s film icons such as Marlon Brando, whose brooding bad boy sexuality did more than heat up the silver screen. James Dean made only 3 films in his entire career, only one of which was released when he was still alive, but he quickly became a symbol of teen angst and rebellion, as well as attraction, as seen in Rebel Without a Cause. Boys wanted to be James Dean. Girls simply wanted him. Marilyn Monroe became the new symbol of female sensuality, bubbling and very blonde. Equally as funny as she was sexual, this first pinup from Playboy magazine was soon selling millions of movie tickets. Not everyone bought into the consumer culture of the 1950s, however. Many young adults across America were sickened by the materialism of America's consumer culture and by the conformity of its suburban communities. Poets and musicians alike joined forces to express their distaste and dismay over the turn of America's culture. Known as the Beat Movement, poets and writers would often read their writings over a bed of low-key jazz music, which is where they got their name from, the Beats. Also known as beatniks, as some of these people embraced the communist ideals of Karl Marx as a protest against the crass commercialism of the post-World War era. Writers such as Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg preached that the road to truth in America was not to be found working at a 9-to-5 job for the man, and then buying a bunch of material goods that will only be junk next year. The Beats, whose primary residence was in New York City, encouraged Americans to turn away from materialism and embrace things like Zen Buddhism as a guide to finding inner peace. They also encouraged Americans to head out onto America's bountiful roads and highways to meet real people and see real America in its cities and its natural landscape. Beats did not want to own a TV. They did not want to wear that gray flannel suit which had become the unofficial uniform of the white-collar world. They did not want to own a home out in the suburbs, and they especially did not want to work as their fathers were doing in a 9-to-5 job that seemed to serve no purpose to anyone. If the creed and lifestyle of the Beats sounds vaguely familiar, that is perhaps because their movement would evolve in the 1960s into the hippie movement.